For those that are visiting, welcome, and welcome to a great place. If you weren't here this morning, the speaker was phenomenal. Okay, the speaker was rushed and didn't feel like he got to any of his points he wanted to, is the true matter. As I looked through the stuff, I think there were 10 or 12 points on each page that I didn't even get to, but I've been known to be extremely over-prepared when I have meetings, and I think I went way past the point. The scary part is I only got through 1/4 of the stuff I prepared, and I was 10 minutes over. So we're going to have to go a little bit quicker and skip a few things, but that's okay. I still want you to get as much as you can out of this, and we're getting more into a little bit more of the science and some of the stuff that's happened in years past. The one thing I forgot that I wanted to mention was that comes up, and they always have the thing in the academics is, well, how could these people live hundreds and hundreds of years? That didn't happen. That's all a story. Well, on the end of your DNA, there's called a telomere, and that is like your shoelace. That little plastic thing you put on, I think it's called aglet, I could be wrong on that, but that little plastic thing on the end of it. So over time, you're born with like a 1 kilobase as the measuring. It's so small, obviously, and it can be about 13. Over time, as you get older, it gets smaller. Well, God, all he had to do is, as God can, just solidify those, and your cell production would continue like you do when you're 14 to 18 and to 22, depending on what the time frame is, and you just keep reducing the cells. In the flesh on Earth, we're like a car in the rust belt. For those young people who don't know what rust is, but those older cars that rusted and the back quarter panel had a big thing in it, that's what our bodies do. We oxidize and we break down. And that's what happens over time, and we can't replenish that oxidation as we could before. So I just wanted to mention that because that was one point I wanted to bring out, because I know that was something that they always try to find something, don't they? Science continually tries to separate us from God. Countries try to separate us from our faith. Everybody's trying to take God away from us, and it's people like you and different congregations that continue to fight to make sure that that doesn't happen. So anyway, we're going to start with DNA. And because of the audience and everything else, I found something, and I was going to go either way, but I'll just read this. DNA is a beautiful, intricate, and works in complicated mechanisms to control the cell. We are made of trillions of cells. There are around 2.5 billion cells in one of our hands, but they are tiny, so tiny that we can't see them. If every cell in your hand was the size of a grain of sand, your hand would be the size of a school bus. Each cell has its own job, just like humans do. Some cells help us detect light and see. Other cells help us to touch. Some cells help us hear. Other cells carry oxygen around. Others help us digest and secrete enzymes. There are 200 cell types in the body, and that is 200 different jobs. But how does each cell know what to do? How do we as humans know what to do? Someone tells us. Our cell told us what to do, but not a person or a computer, our cells. And that's why DNA is such a very special molecule. It's a record of instructions telling us the cell what the job is to be. DNA is like a whole set of blueprints for the cell. A computer code telling a PC what to do. It's written in a special alphabet that's only 4 letters long. And those are A, T, G, C. And I always remember that. G-A-C-T, God and Christ together made life. Now that's obviously not what they stand for, but that's how I remember it. A and T are best friends. They always hang out together. G and C are our best friends. They usually hang out together. They're like jigsaw puzzles, and you cannot force them. As much as they want you to think that it just happened by chance and these just came together to do things, I'll demonstrate later that that is just an absolute impossibility. Each sentence tells the cell to make a special molecule called a protein. These proteins control everything in a cell. So as we go on, I'm not going to read too much more, but because of time, but the premise of Darwin before what we have now in technology was just, he looked at things and made some assumptions. Once we got into microbiology, and now that we're getting even more in depth and we are looking at the cells, it is like a city. There is so much going on within the cell, it's almost hard to describe, and we're getting to understand it more and more, but it's going to take a while. And the thing with DNA that you'll always hear on the news is, oh, well, we can just go in and we can turn this off and then everything will be fine. Or we can go in and turn this on. Let me tell you, the problem with that is if you turn something on, something else gets turned off. If you turn something off, something else turns on, and you don't know what's going to happen. So in the day and age of where we think a lot of things can happen, that's not the case. The one line in here that I wanted to say is the slow, steady change found in DNA over time are known as mutations. Well, that's their big word for evolution. Mutations, there's several different types. You can have hypertrophy, which is left ventricular hypertrophy. You'll have that in athletes or runners like Ryan. Hyperplasia is the growth of cells. And say you play the guitar a lot, and all of a sudden you get a callus on your thumb. Well, that's from that. Your body responds to that stimulus and tries to protect it. But mutations are basically genes that break down. You have a dominant and you have a recessive. The dominant one is the one that says we need to grow. Well, if that's broken, it just continues to grow. The other part of the gene that's broken is P53. Now, P53 goes in and says stop, and it also says we need to take care of this, which is calls out the immune system. Our immune system, the innate part, the adaptive, is so interconnected and has so many different messaging systems that it's instantaneous. And we're not going to go into all that, but that's what happens, and that's what mutations are. I mean, we call it cancer. Every one of us has been affected by it. I was named for an uncle that died of it. It touches our lives every day. I don't like the term that says we're going to cure cancer because that's ridiculous. There are many types. Everyone responds differently. We're getting so much better with even oral meds and different types of chemo. We're now coming out with stuff that bump up the immune system. So T cells will go after cancer cells. So we're coming a ways with it. So RNA has a lot of different functions. It really basically just copies the information, transfers it, and then the ribosomal RNA, ribosomes are kind of like the construction company that makes it happen. I'll talk about this briefly as well. Evolutionists don't like to talk about the origin of life. They'll do about everything they can to get away from it, actually. Research, because it has been such a dead end. But if chemicals never assembled themselves into the first living thing, evolution could never get started. So to keep hope alive, every once in a while over the last 60 years, they've announced discoveries that supposedly bring us closer to the understanding of how life on Earth began. However, the main lesson scientists have learned over those decades is that long molecules, polymers, which is polymany, that allow biological creatures to work must be isolated in pure concentrations for there to be any chance of success. Unfortunately, that can only happen in biochemistry labs, computer simulations, and living cells. In other settings, the products are unstable due to contamination, unwanted reactions with other chemicals, and concentrations that fall apart very quickly, kind of into a tar. Back in, in the Miller-Urey experiment, happened in about 1952, and they put together a simulation that they thought was like the primordial soup. And they shocked that thing like, I'm surprised it didn't glow in the dark by the time they were done. They kept shocking it and shocking it and shocking it like it was lightning strikes that all of a sudden spontaneously created us. And at the end of it, nothing. Absolutely nothing. So it continues, and this is the hard part. The theory of evolution says life started from raw chemicals. Evolutionists long ago handed the problem off to specialists, trusting that they would come up with something. The specialists have spent many frustrating decades trying to figure out how DNA assembled itself. They have two approaches, actually three, to the problem, and those on one side think the other side is wrong, of course, as it is in academics. Here's the essence of both views, and I'll add a third. But here, I'm going to take a step back. We've failed in any continuous way to provide a recipe that gets from the simple molecules that we know were present on early Earth to RNA. The first paradox is a tendency of organic matter to devolve and to give into tar. If you can avoid that, you can start to try to assemble things that are not tarry, but then you encounter the water problem, which is related to the fact that interesting bond that is made unstable thermodynamically with respect to water. If you can solve that problem to be present in a low concentration, therefore to assemble a large number of those building blocks, you get a gene like RNA, 100 nucleotides long, that finds entropy, which is basically disorder. Or in thermodynamics, it's a problem that, I gotta say this right, by part of the energy is not available for the total cell or for what it's doing. So basically they don't really know how to do it. Let's go through kind of the ways they go through. They've been dominated by a couple fundamentally ones, but then there's another one that's really kind of come up in the later decades. It's kind of the replicated first approach, metabolism first scenario. Both schools acknowledge the critical requirement for primitive evolvable systems in the Darwin scheme is solve problems of information storage. It's interesting, I've watched a couple of the debates, and they couldn't agree what time of day it is, I don't think, on some of these. They go back and forth, and theory after theory. The mainstream one was that prebiotic evolution scenario is the RN's world. Textbooks often assert that life began with specialized complex molecules such as RNA that are capable of making copies of their own. Well, we've already just talked about it, that they can't even make it in the lab with the best minds. It doesn't happen. No matter how they've tried through the years, you just can't do it. An alternative appears to be that RNA-centric paradigm of origin. No known cellular constituent is capable of self-replication as proved form. DNA is absolutely dependent on the other cellular components to make its own copies. One is compelled to consider an alternative, that self-replication has never been property of individual molecules, but rather molecule assemblies. But basically there's steps that have to be in place for this to work, and they can't reproduce those steps. So the third way now that you'll hear a lot about is there are small changes in creatures, microevolution, that leads to new types of creature, macroevolution. But some evolutionary biologists are admitting that microevolution does not happen by the supposed mechanisms of evolution. Mutation, natural selection. Instead, the living things have built-in mechanisms that adjust to quick changes in their environment to produce variation, which would be, we talked about before, there's a difference between patterns and codes. Codes is DNA that's already built in. However, 61 evolution academics have put their name and faces on the third way, and it's gained popularity as it does. So I'm going to go through this part quickly because I don't want to get so far in the science that you're lost and extremely bored. But this is how ridiculous it is. So you start with a molecule we're talking at the very beginning. You start with a molecule capable of copying itself. Then you add a fatty acid bubble forms around the self-copying molecule, which is DNA to RNA and transcribe. The double-strand RNA separates into single strands. Next, the organisms have added protein, making up their bag of chemical tricks. They have protein-based catalysts or enzymes that gradually replace the ribosomes. Later, the organisms have learned to make DNA on their own. So this is reality. Get a large box. Draw controls and gauges on the inside. Cut out a door, round windows, attach cardboard fins to the sides. Put a chair in the box, sit down, and start the countdown. Launch the spaceship towards the moon using the moon's gravity. Flying the spaceship to the outer reaches of the solar system, constantly accelerating with impulse engines. After passing Neptune, engage the warp drive in a direction perpendicular to the plane of the elliptical to avoid the Kuiper belt. The children are working on steps 1 and 2 and are as close to demonstrating their vision as origin of life researchers are. So that kind of puts in perspective the difficulty, the complexity, the absolute knowledge that you would have to create what is on this planet, and how hard it is to think that this even remotely was by chance or by a strike of lightning to a certain amount of molecules, that all of this grew, that we happened. So one of the challenges for them is too slow when they replicate. The copying is not correct, it's not close. Incorrect backbone connections. So if you think about DNA, and I always try to come up with analogies for people, you know when you get bread or pretzel bread or whatever else, you either have the plastic clip that secures it that always breaks when you take it off the first time, or in the olden days you had the twisty things, the green things that twist. Well, that's kind of like DNA. You've got two strands that are made up of sugar phosphate on the outside, and then you have GACT in the middle that are sequenced, and then they twist. It's like a helix that's twisted. And that's very hard because they can't separate those strands very well. So the strands then have to be separated, and then they have to figure out how to get them back together. There's a lot of other chemical stuff, but I don't want to get too much. Wow, time goes fast when you're up here. Here's how evolution of life is suppressed. Darwin said we all come from primates. Did you know in recent studies, dogs actually outperformed chimpanzees in tests? In 1912, Darwin's missing link is discovered in Piltdown, England. Experts instantly declared Piltdown Man to be 250,000 years old to 1,000,000 years old. Problem with that explained later. 1953, whoops, carbon dating proved the skull of a 600-year-old woman and the jaw of a 500-year-old orangutan. Nebraska man, derived from a tooth which turned out to be an extinct pig. Java man, found in the early 20th century as a piece of skull, a thigh bone, and 3 molar teeth. The rest was filled in by plaster of Paris and later determined to be just another human skeleton. Heidelberg man, came from a jawbone but was rejected because it's just like the modern man. Don't use Neanderthal man to prove it. Later it was determined he died of exposure, stooped over because of disease. No missing link. Ever-changing science, never-changing Bible. Still remember, God made rules for spiritual, God made rules for nature. You cannot break them. The moral dilemma that we may have at some point, maybe not in our lifetimes, is cloning. I know they're already starting and they're talking about cloning. Say if someone had an arm or a leg taken off in war, can you get that and then attach? There's a whole bunch of things going on. The part that comes up if you clone a human, what's the moral dilemma then? They have no memories. They're just a copy. And I think that's where we're stepping over a line medically, so to speak. Another example of science hiding from the truth. Did dinosaurs soar? Imaginations certainly took flight over a bird-like fossil with a meat-eater's tail, was sprinted out of northeast China to Tucson. And you remember this because this is from Jurassic Park. Big lynx birds came from dinosaurs, a missing link. The National Geographic Society in DC displayed this missing link to thousands and thousands of visitors. They even used this premise in the movie Jurassic Park. I'm afraid that the paleontologists are eating crow, so to speak. It appears the tail was likely tacked on by the farmer that discovered it and supposedly paid a lot of money for it. Don't do that. The real problem that we can't debate is gaps in the fossil graveyard, where there should be. But there's nothing. Evolution and the fossil records are completely in conflict. So when I first showed those in the morning, I showed how they went in their little drawings from little chimpanzee to the guy that's standing erect. If you have that over millions of years, if you have this and this and this and this and this, why is it they can't find all these skeletons? Femur, heart, bone, and body. Whether it's animals that went from the T-Rex to the hummingbird, or from the chimpanzee to the human, where's the fossils? That's one question they don't want any part of, the evolutionists. They have things that will say, well, because of this and because of that, that didn't happen. But in reality, they're not there because it never happened. But they're just not going to go with that. Here's some of the things that have happened, and you've heard of these. The age of the universe continues to be an evolution that states that the earth is billions of years old. Yet a little translation of the Bible implies it's thousands of years old. Carbon dating methods are flawed, so anything carbon dated beyond a few hundred years isn't based on sound science. It has a smaller half-life. Carbon within the atmosphere can change. I get some of this from the father-in-law, by the way. Depending on lightning, depending on what happened with our atmosphere as far as was there a huge volcanic eruption, whatever else can change it. There are huge discrepancies in radiometric dating. And here's the problem. So if you want to date something and you look at it now, you have to be able to go back then to actually test it to see what it is and how much radioactivity it is or what the measurements are. You can't just make a guess. And since God is infinitely smart and ridiculously powerful, he can just make it. It's just there. But they still try to say they can prove it, but there's huge discrepancies. And you look at different stuff and they go back and forth on that as well. There's evidence that points to a young Earth. Scholars of Hebrew agree that the Bible describes 6 literal days of creation. If he can make man like that, he can do whatever he wants like that. I don't know why that's so hard to understand. If you're all powerful and you actually made this, one of the books that came out lately is Dan Brown's Origins. And I know Da Vinci Code, and then Christ had killed, everybody in the world thought Christ had children, and then he had to come on and say, no, I was just fiction. Now he built stuff in. So Origin is basically all about where we were, where we are, and where are we going. And it deals with AI and stuff. It's not very well written, to be honest with you. But one of the things he has in there is the long hallway scenario. And he always puts this stuff in now because there's always this question mark. So if you're in a long hallway, it's infinite, both sides, and you hear a bouncy ball behind you, and it just continues to bounce and bounce, and you hear it, and goes by you and just keeps bouncing. Well, who made the hallway? Who made the bouncing ball? Who made you? And that's the question he kind of slides into the books now that says, listen, I don't know, this is fiction. God really did this. Someone had to start it. It didn't just happen on its own. Archaeology, as we know, and many of you have come up or have had different talks, we continue to go back and farther to prove things that actually did happen when they said. The Bible states that the universe displays the glory of God, and the fine balance of the earth was created as a home for mankind. Evolution is macroevolution. The funny thing is, we're constantly told that evolution is fact, and the Bible is a bunch of stories. That we are animals evolved out of something that came out of the prehistoric soup and evolved out of this. The real truth is evolution is a bunch of myths, and the Bible is a bunch of facts. So, if someone's doing great in the water, why do they come out of the water? If they come out of the water, why do they go back in the water? If they were swimming, how did they walk out? I mean, it just goes on and on and on until you're kind of bogged down. Okay. Quick, I love giraffes, by the way. Great animals. They have a huge thing on, in many of the textbooks, that the kids at school and everything else love giraffes. And what it is that over time, the trees got higher and the giraffe's neck grew, and that's why they get it. And it's such baloney. The giraffe is an incredible animal, by the way. The dark spots basically allow heat to leak out. The legs on a giraffe are so unbelievable. They're like the best compression stockings ever thought. Man, of course, created them. But you've got to shoot all that blood back up, and that's why the heart is so big, the lungs are a little bit different. You've got this long neck where you got to breathe in and out of. Well, the point of the whole story is that the acacia trees that they're talking about is about 16% of their diet. And the females are a little bit shorter, and they can't reach some of it. And then they went through and they looked at it, and they're like, well, most of the stuff they eat is grass or lower, depending on floods, depending on rain, all this stuff. So it just completely blew it out of the water. So every textbook they looked at had this explanation of giraffes. Well, just in simple analysis, it's just not true. So I wanted to include that just to say that it just continues on and on. It gets kind of monotonous, so to speak. Evolutionists assume evolution is true, then write endlessly about it, when and where it happened, rates, lineages, how it's possible to have macroevolution, and that all the rest is just fantasy. There's only two choices. Either everything rose by random chance, or we had an intelligent design. Now here's one of my little displays. The sad thing is I also ordered a little DNA thing when I was doing the brain thing. And there's nothing worse than getting a package from Amazon, opening it up, and it says made in China, because right away you're like, oh no. So it was DNA, you're supposed to pull it out, and I did it the first time and it just flew everywhere. So I don't have that, I'm sorry, I know you're probably really disappointed. So microplasm's in the urinary tract. It is one of the simplest cells you have in your body. It's got 418 proteins, it's got 562,000 bases of DNA, just under a 1,200 base pair of GACT. Now, so I made my own little DNA. It's 1,200 base pairs. And so I'm going to I'm going to unravel the helix, and I'm going to cut off 150 blocks out of the 1,200. So 150 of the 12. Now, what are the chances that 150 of those protein base pairs coming together in line to do what that microplasm cell wants it to do. One out of one, and that's 65 sets of 3 zeros. On that little thing, on your simplest cell of your body, in your urinary tract, has a very simple purpose. We're not talking about eye, we're not talking about heart, anything else. So, now I'm going to go ahead and cut off the other one. So what are the chances of that? Well, of course, they're the same. 1 in 65 sets of zeros. Now, the theory that they'll say now is, well, these just bond naturally together, they have attractions, all that. Well, yeah, you know, G and C like to bond and T and A like to bond, but they don't have like this automatic response that just bonds them. You know, like it's not by chance. So the chances of both of them working together, on both sides put together, 150 on each side, which is just about 1/10 of that one DNA strand. And I don't even know what that number is. I just stopped making zeros, to be honest with you. And that's how complicated it is. So if they tell you it was by chance, they don't know what they're talking about. It's really, the both chains together is too big to calculate. I always like to use the reference of put a broken clock in a box and shake it. I'll give you 100 million years. Shake that box and see if that clock goes back together. Put a bunch of parts of a garage like this Mercedes-Benz, put it in Oklahoma over 250 million years and see if a tornado will go through and put that car back together again. The chances of that happening are better than the base pairs of those things going together. So, in fact, I'll make it easier. Give me a little red wagon like we had when we were little. Young people don't know what that is. But it's just a little thing with 4 wheels, 2 little axles, and a little pull handle. Take that apart, put it in the garage. Give me 100 million years. I bet that thing doesn't go back together either. Well, I know it won't. So it just can't happen, not without God. A careful examination of the results of the analysis of several meteorites led scientists who conducted the work to different conclusions. Inanimate nature has a bias towards the formation of molecules made of fewer rather than greater numbers of carbon atoms, and thus shows no partiality in favor of creating the building blocks of our kind of life. RNA's building blocks are complex substance. Anyway, organic molecules. I'm trying to talk too fast because I know I'm running out of time. Their point was that the one theory where a meteor hits Earth and then all of a sudden we spring to life. So I'm going to fast forward this because I really am out of time. Basically, this is what it's saying is your kids are going to expose a lot of, they call it propaganda about this. Like I said before, they're going to continually try to take God out of your lives. One of it's about control, and one thing that I've learned from my father-in-law is if someone wants to control a country is take away their learning and take away their faith. And I will tell you, in all the stuff that I've studied, and I know Social Security is kind of a mess, and it's a pass the monkey, and when it was instituted, life expectancy was 61 years. The number one reason that you have a longevity in your life is faith. Bar none. All the stuff in medicine, all the things that we've come up with, all the new things for cholesterol and heart and cancer, the number one thing is faith. Doesn't get close. Now, one of the things that people are saying is, why aren't we expanding our faith and our longevity? And why has it slowed down so much? Well, I'll tell you why it's slowed down. If you look at what's happened to Europe, and as we're going through, the loss of Christianity, the loss of it in the youth, and you can see it in America as the churches close, as they take away the 10 Commandments in our courthouses. All that things comes into play. So, I hope this is kind of what you learned today. I'm sorry it had to be so fast, and I appreciate the elders for giving me 2 spots to talk. Really, the random evolution of life is just mathematically impossible. Scientific laws point scientists to Creator, whether they want to believe it or not. You know, you know in your hearts. There's an absence of transitional fossils. We talked about that. If there is such a transition, where is it? It doesn't show a clear evolution of anything. We understand genetics. We understand more of how complex it is. There hasn't been any kind of new animal that's been observed. So it's some other stuff, that people have said that absolutely, and there's some stuff within Job that was so far ahead of its time that we didn't understand. So my first lesson I ever gave was on the 10 virgins and the lamps of oil. So I always use it at the end. At some point, you need to make a decision. At some point, you might have to defend your position on creation. At some point, you need to decide, do you really believe in your spiritual heart and mind in God, Christ, the Bible, before the cry at midnight? I hope today I made you think. Today, I hope I made you realize how complex and how beautiful creation we are. If you have any problems, if you have any doubts, if you have any spiritual needs whatsoever, if you have any questions, there are so many great people here to help you. If you do, come forward as we stand and sing.